All right, cool cats and kittens. Let's go ahead and get started with Act 5, Scene 1, 2, and 3. Let's finish out this story. Remember, when we first started, the whole purpose and reason why Friar Lawrence agreed to assist Romeo and Juliet in this is because he thought that their love for each other would be enough to end the feud amongst the Montagues and the Capulets. That is very, very important. So in scene 1 of Act 5, Romeo is kind of wandering the streets of Mantua, and he's kind of thinking about this weird dream he had the night before. And the dream he had was that Juliet had died, right? She was dead, and it doesn't really go into much detail about how it is that she died, but he has this dream. Well, then Balthazar arrives with news from Verona, and the news is that he tells Romeo of Juliet's apparent suicide. Now, Balthazar does not know that this was a faked suicide. Romeo does not know of the plan. He believes she is dead. And so he immediately orders Balthazar to prepare the horses so that he can go to Verona. Even though he's banished, he says, I must see her body. And while Balthazar is preparing the horses, he begins to write a letter to Lord Montague, and he explains the entire situation from the start to the finish, right? From the time the serving men gave him the invitation to the first time he saw Juliet and was in love, to everything in between, the fact that they are married, why he's banished because of this attack by Tybalt, and so forth and so on. Okay. Before he leaves, he stops and he buys some poison. Okay. Again, think, why would he buy poison? Well, if Juliet is in fact dead, I do not want to live either, is Romeo's apparent reasoning. So he buys this poison. Scene 2, Friar John arrives to talk to Friar Lawrence. Now, Friar John is the friar that Friar Lawrence tasked with getting the letter explaining the plan to Romeo. Friar John kind of apologizes. So scene 2 right here is very, very important to the rest of this story. He apologizes for not being able to do what he was tasked with. And the reason he says he couldn't do it is because on his way to Mantua, some men spotted him, accused him of carrying the plague, right? They accused him of being sick. Kind of coincidental with the virus going around, right? They accused him of having it and locked him in a house so that he could not get the others sick. And so he was unable to complete that task. Friar Lawrence immediately panics, right? He immediately knows the problems that this has caused. Surely Romeo has received word by now, but more importantly, Juliet is going to wake up in 48 hours and they are going to have entombed her inside this mausoleum. And so he rushes to the Capulet tomb, and he orders that Friar John to grab the crowbar, and he goes. That leads us to scene 3, the final scene in our story here. Paris, who is in mourning, just lost his soon-to-be wife in his eyes on his wedding day, is standing guard of the tomb door with his squire, if you will, or a page. And so the reason he's standing guard is because he doesn't want anyone to try to grave rob, right? Steal the riches from inside the tomb. When all of a sudden, Romeo and Balthazar appear. Romeo is obviously trying to get in to the tomb to see, and if in fact Juliet is dead, but to see her one last time. And Paris is standing there blocking the path. What Paris recognizes Romeo as the man who killed Tybalt, and immediately thinks that this man, Romeo, is coming back to desecrate the grave or Juliet's body, and he is not going to allow it. He immediately puts up resistance, draws his sword, and they begin to fight. Romeo wins. He kills Paris. The page freaks out, runs to fetch the police, if you will, and report what has happened. Well, this time, Romeo opens the tomb. He is inside. He sees Juliet's appears to be lifeless body. Again, he does not know that this was all fake. This was a part of the plan. He sees her. He is emotional. He is weeping. Go back to it. He doesn't use logic and reason. He drinks the poison. He says, if I can't be with you, I don't want to live. I will join you on the other side. And he drinks the poison. Kisses her lips and dies. Thus, with a kiss, I die. Unfortunately, just as he falls, Friar Lawrence arrives. He says, St. Francis be my speed, how oft tonight have my old feet stumbled at graves, who's there? And when Friar Lawrence, hoping that he was in time, sees Balthazar, you have nothing but a reason to think Friar Lawrence knows he's too late already. And he finds out that Romeo is inside. He goes in and sees both of the bodies, laying, lifeless. And then Juliet awakes. When Juliet awakes, she looks over to the side and she sees Romeo there, his lifeless body. And Friar Lawrence kind of sees where this is headed, and she immediately says, no, Juliet, don't do anything drastic, right? Come on out. And we can talk about this, and everything's going to work itself out. And Juliet says, no, that can't be. And she says, I'm going to join him and be with him. I cannot live this life without him, right? And she kisses his lips, thinking that the poison that is still there on his lips will be enough to kill her. And it doesn't work. And so instead, she takes out the dagger and she stabs herself. And she dies. This time, Paris's page arrives with the watchman, the police. And soon after, the prince arrives. And what's said with the prince arrives with Lord Capulet and also Lord Montague. And what has occurred here is something kind of beautiful. Obviously, not the death and suicide part. What happens after? The families realize we've pushed this to this point. Our hatred has led these two young, beautiful people to think that this was the only solution. And so, one other thing. When Lord Montague arrives, he announces that Lady Montague has died from a broken heart. So in just this very situation, 3 beautiful, innocent souls have perished because of this long, pointless feud. And so Lord Montague, recognizing this, says, you know what? I'm going to do my son's honor And I am going to build a golden statue for all of Verona to admire, and it is going to be of Juliet and her beauty. And that will be the way that our family can repay. And to not be outdone, Lord Capulet says, you know what, we're going to do the same. We are going to build a statue for all to see, and it is going to be of Romeo, and we're going to put them next to each other. And the prince and the friar recognize this almost immediately. The death of these two innocent souls, their love for one another, is what ended this family feud, and the prince even recognizes it. He says, "For never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo." And the play ends by celebrating the end of the feud, not necessarily by mourning the deaths only, but celebrating the end of the feud that were laminated by the deaths of the young lovers. Okay? And that line there. These two lines here are very, very important. For never was a story of more woe, right? The tragedy of pain, suffering, than this of Juliet and her Romeo. But however, with that suffering and with that pain and with that tragedy, a great, beautiful thing happened. These two families were able to put everything aside to end this feud and finally be happy. And we talked about all of that foreshadowing. Everything that occurred in this story was foreshadowed prior. Friar Lawrence saying he believed these two people, by becoming married and being in love, would end the feud. It did. It didn't necessarily end the way he thought it would, but it did in fact end the feud. Okay? And that'll do for Act 5.